الله نزل أحسن الحديث كتابا متشابها مثانية تقشعر منه جلود الذين يخشون ربهم.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Welcome to another episode of Quran Circle 11, where we talking this time about women in the Quran and the verses that mentions women, whether it's rulings, whether it's individual Muslim women throughout the history of Islam, which starts with Adam alayhi salam till Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And some of the things that we need to learn, and as we would see from the very beginning to the end of the Quran, how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala honored women. And really there's no such a thing in the deen of Islam as women and men and competition between both. We don't see that in the deen of Allah, because they're both, everyone, are creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most just. It's when other nations, when people altered the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala before the religion of Islam, when they humiliated one another, when they oppressed one another, this is for them. But when it comes to the deen of Allah, the perfect way of life, the religion of Islam, there's nothing less than perfect. And this is really something that we would see. And yes, to recognize that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created men and women. There are differences, there are physical differences, emotional differences. So therefore the rulings, the ahkam that is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then has to be according to these differences. Otherwise it becomes injustice. And we witness this justice in the rulings that is in the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. So as mentioned before, we'll take some passages from the Quran inshallah. And we need to listen to the beautiful recitation and be attentive and follow with the recitation so that we can learn how to recite. And then we talk briefly, inshallah ta'ala, about these verses. So before we start, I would like to introduce the reciters with us today. We have Sheikh Abdul Khaliq Atiyah. Welcome to the program. Barakallah feek. And Sheikh Asad Al-Hawi. Allah yabarak feekum. Sheikh Ahmad Rajab. Jazakumullah khairan for coming, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless these gatherings. And as always, we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us sincerity of intentions. And we'll start, inshallah ta'ala, with still being in Surah Al-Baqarah and verses 218 to 221. Kada mushaf, inshallah ta'ala, open it and follow, inshallah. 218 to 221. And Sheikh Abdul Khaliq, go ahead and recite for us, inshallah.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. إن الذين آمنوا والذين هاجروا وجاهدوا في سبيل الله أولئك يرجون رحمة الله والله غفور رحيم. يسألونك عن الخمر والميسر قل فيهما إثم كبير ومنافع للناس وإثمهما أكبر. يسألونك عن الخمر والميسر قل فيهما إثم كبير ومنافع للناس وإثمهما أكبر من نفعهما ويسألونك ماذا ينفقون قل العفو كذلك يبين الله لكم الآيات لعلكم تتفكرون في الدنيا والآخرة. ويسألونك عن اليتامى قل إصلاح لهم خير وإن تخالطوهم فإخوانكم والله يعلم المفسد من المصلح ولو شاء الله لأعنتكم ولو شاء الله لأعنتكم إن الله عزيز حكيم ولا تنكحوا المشركات حتى يؤمن ولأمة مؤمنة خير من مشركة ولو أعجبتكم ولا تنكحوا المشركات حتى يؤمن ولأمة مؤمنة خير من مشركة ولو أعجبتكم ولا تنكحوا المشركين حتى يؤمنوا ولعبد مؤمن خير من مشرك ولو أعجبكم أولئك يدعون إلى النار والله يدعو إلى الجنة والمغفرة بإذنه ويبين آياته للناس لعلهم يتذكرون.
Barakallahu feek, mashallah. Beautiful recitation. These verses, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned the believers both men and women, those who believe and they migrated with the Prophet ﷺ and they strove for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They are the ones that hope for the rewards from Allah. Because ar-raja, to hope for the rewards from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, requires actions. Not someone that is not doing anything and having this false hope, but rather they have the iman and the fear of Allah and they migrated with the Prophet ﷺ. They did all of this hoping for the rewards from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and He subhanahu wa ta'ala the most forgiver, the most merciful. The verses, as we heard, the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, they asked the Prophet ﷺ very few questions because the wahy revelation was coming down on them. They asked the Prophet ﷺ about intoxicants, they asked him about gambling and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forbade it for them, and stating the fact that there are some benefit to it, but the sinful act and the harm from it is far greater than the benefit, and therefore Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forbade it. And they asked the Prophet ﷺ what is an obligation upon them when it comes to spending. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed to the Prophet ﷺ to say that it's al-afu, only the extra, only the things that is not part of their necessities. And this is ayat and signs from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for people to reflect. The verse that mentions women, which is verse number 221, where they asked the Prophet ﷺ also about the orphans, but also to reflect upon this worldly life and the hereafter. And what does that mean? It means that how this worldly life passes so quickly, and that the hereafter is the everlasting one. Never to forget, so that the hearts are attached to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, seeking the rewards from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the hereafter, and not to be deceived in this life, and to apply these commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from them. So the answers come, and then afterwards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forbidding the believing men not to marry the idol worshippers of the women. So this is a hukm, this is a ruling that is very clear. As it's mentioned in Surah Al-Ma'idah, there's an exception from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the women from the people of the book. But here al-mushrikat, the idol worshippers, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forbidding men to marry till they believe, and praising women, those who are believers. So the criteria of praise and who is good and who is evil is all based on al-iman and faith. It doesn't matter whether a person is a man or a woman, whether a person is black or white or whatever there is. It's only about the matters of faith, matters of belief, matters of righteousness. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, in akramakum indallahi atqakum, the most honored among you by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are those who have more fear of Allah, those who are more modest among you. So that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says that a believing woman is better and it's more virtue than someone that associate partners with Allah. Even if the one that is mushrika, even if the one that associate partners with Allah, you like her more. So this is what brings you back to the faith, is to choose the one that has faith, the one that is obedient to Allah. And the same thing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala addressed the guardian of the women, not to allow them to marry the mushrikeen, those who idol worship, those who worship other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that a believing man is better than a mushrik. So as you see, the verse talks about women, talks about men, and what the criteria of virtue is, the criteria of al-iman and obedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. One of the profound things that are mentioned in the verse that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and it makes things as if it's so vivid in front of our eyes, أُولَٰئِكَ يَدْعُونَ إِلَى النَّارِ. They are the ones that calling you to the fire. If you do this, you are being called to the fire by those who are idol worshippers, by the disbelievers. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala invites you to the Jannah of Allah, to the forgiveness from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And He make the ayat and the signs and the rulings from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala very clear for people to be reminded. So as you see here, both men and women are addressed, that the most valuable thing is al-iman, is matters of faith. And be careful, not just when something that you like, you get your heart attached to someone, but what is that someone? Whether it's a friend, whether it's a spouse, are they believers? Are they people that worship other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? If they do, then you stay away and you choose the believers because they're better than them and they're more virtue because they understood the purpose of their life and they're obedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We'll go to the next set of verses inshallah ta'ala, which is right after this, so you don't have to go anywhere. Continuing inshallah ta'ala with verses 222 to 225. And Sheikh Asad, go ahead and recite for us inshallah.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم ويسألونك عن المحيض قل هو أذى فاعتزلوا النساء في المحيض قل هو أذى فاعتزلوا النساء في المحيض ولا تقربوهن حتى يطهرن فإذا تطهرن فأتوهن من حيث أمركم الله إن الله يحب التوابين ويحب المتطهرين نساؤكم حرث لكم فأتوا حرثكم أنى شئتم وقدموا لأنفسكم واتقوا الله واعلموا أنكم ملاقوه وبشر المؤمنين ولا تجعلوا الله عرضة لأيمانكم أن تبروا وتتقوا وتصلحوا بين الناس والله سميع عليم لا يؤاخذكم الله باللغو في أيمانكم ولكن يؤاخذكم بما كسبت قلوبكم لا يؤاخذكم الله باللغو في أيمانكم ولكن يؤاخذكم بما كسبت قلوبكم والله غفور حليم.
Inshallah, barakallahu feek. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward you. So here the questioning was about al-mahid or the menses, which is of course something that is specific for women. And it was said that the verse was revealed because the Jews in Medina at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, whenever the woman would get her monthly menses, they would isolate themselves completely from her. They don't sit and eat with her. They don't do anything whatsoever. That she becomes completely in isolation. So the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, they asked the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, so the verses were revealed, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala stated in the verse that the blood of menses is impure, so therefore you stay away from being intimate with them. And when they asked the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, he said, you do everything except the intercourse. So everything is permissible except, the sexual relations. So, which is basically the intercourse. Other than that, everything is permissible. And this is where the ease that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed to the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. And this is something that Allah ordained upon women, where in these counted days, they don't make salah, they don't fast. And if it's Ramadan, they make up the fasting, but they don't make up the salah. Once they're pure, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala permitted the men to be back to their spouses again, but without physically isolating them. And the Prophet ﷺ, and he is the one that gave us the tafsir and the explanation of how the verses are. He would sleep on the lap of Aisha radiallahu anha when she was in her menses. And this is something to show and to teach the ummah of the Prophet ﷺ that it's okay to be as close as it is and not to put them away or physically to be away. And then the verses also talk about how the relationship between men and women, when people also they thought that it's forbidden to have the relations whether in different positions, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, no shyness in matters of the religion. He mentioned that your wives are tilth for you. So you come to them the way you like, as long as it's in the place where the child comes out from. This is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala permitted, not in a forbidden way. And with these commands, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordered the believers to fear Allah, to have the taqwa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and to remember that you will meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So even with these types of relationships, an intimate relationship, this is something that a person fulfill his desire and he get rewards for it because he's doing it in the permissible way, and to stay away from what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forbade, because it's not just about governing this life, because it's about the hereafter, and the people will be questioned and responsible for their actions, and in the hereafter either they get rewards or wal'iyadu billah, punished by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave the glad tidings to the believers, also commanding them not to make their oath as an excuse for them to not to do good or to rectify a situation between people. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the all-hearer, the all-knower subhanahu wa ta'ala. But if someone make an oath by a slip of a tongue or not something that is well established in his heart, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most forgiver and he is the most forbearing subhanahu wa ta'ala. So as we see here, some of the rulings. Otherwise there are so many different rulings. Just for us to understand, we need to learn our deen. And there are rulings that are specific for men. They need to learn it. There are rulings specific for women. It's obligatory upon them to learn so that they fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and they're obedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala according to these rulings. And with that, we'll continue inshallah ta'ala with the next verses in the same place, but this time verses 226 till 228. Verses 226 to 228. And Shaykh Ahmed, go ahead and recite for us inshallah.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم للذين يؤلون من نسائهم تربص 4 أشهر فإن فاءوا فإن الله غفور رحيم للذين يؤلون من نسائهم تربص 4 أشهر فإن فاءوا فإن الله غفور رحيم وإن عزموا الطلاق فإن الله سميع عليم.
226 227 228 229 230 231 232 233 234 235 236 237 238 239 240 241 242 243 244 245 246 247 248 249 250 251 252 253 254 255 256 257 258 259 260 261 262 263 264 265 266 267 268 269 270 271 272 273 274 275 276 277 278 279 280 281 282 283 284 285 286 287 288 289 290 291 292 293 294 295 296 297 298 299 200 201 202 203 204 205 206 207 208 209 210 211 212 213 214 215 216 217 218 219 220 221 222 223 224 225 226 227 228 229 230 231 232 233 234 235 236 237 238 239 240 241 242 243 244 245 246 247 248
والمطلقات يتربصن بأنفسهن ثلاثة قروء ولا يحل لهن أن يكتمن ما خلق الله في أرحامهن ما خلق الله في أرحامهن إن كن يؤمن بالله واليوم الآخر وبعولتهن أحق بردهن في ذلك إن أرادوا إصلاحا ولهن مثل الذي عليهن بالمعروف وللرجال عليهن درجة والله عزيز حكيم.
Inshallah, barakallahu feek, jazakumullahu khairan. So this is with what's mentioned about taking an oath or making an oath and not to make it as an excuse not to do good. So verse number 26 talks about the men, those who would swear that they would never approach their wives intimately, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forbade that for them. And they're given a period of 4 months, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned. If before the 4 months they take back their oath, therefore they have to expiate for it with the ways to expiate for the oath, and then there's no harm on them and they can go back to their wives again. But if they would wait for 4 months, then the wife is to be divorced, because this is something that is not permissible for a man to do so if he does not break his oath, if he does not expiate for it. And that's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded the believers to observe and to stay away from these things that brings all kinds of harm and against the good living that they are commanded to be with one another, and not to fall into any level of abuse when it comes to anything towards the women. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordered the men to take care of them. And the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, he would say, "Istawsu bin nisa'i khayra," take care of your women. And taking care of them by being extremely gentle with them and having the best manners with them. Because in return, as the next verses talks about وَلِلرِّجَالِ عَلَيْهِنَّ دَرَجَةً, that men, they have a level above the women, meaning that they have to be obedient to their husbands and they spend money on them and they are of a higher level, meaning not to abuse them because they're commanded to be kind to them. And this is how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created human beings. They're not all in the same level. Some is in authority of others. So the men are in authority over their wives, over their household. They are in charge of their households. They will be questioned by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala about this authority. And really it becomes a silly matter when people question this. And when it comes to questioning this, they will go to work and their CEO or their boss will give them an order and they would submit themselves and fulfill the orders of their boss, because they're getting money for it. The same thing when it comes to our households. There is someone in charge, which is the husband. Is not, as people call it, a partnership that means that they can dispute in every matter. No, the men are in charge. But they're commanded to be kind and extremely kind towards their wife, to the extent of which that you would even feel that she is in charge. But this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned with regards to this. And then the verses talked about the divorce and the iddah, which is the waiting period after the divorce, and which is 3 quru, whether it's menses or the period of purification, with the differences of opinions. And many said it's basically the menses. That means within this waiting period, if it's the first or the second divorce, they still continue to be together in the same household, and she doesn't leave without the permission of her husband. If the waiting period is finished, then the divorce is irrevocable. And before that, he has the right to take his wife back, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said. And it's always associated with matters of belief, the fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If you truly believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and in the hereafter, do not conceal what's in your wombs. So after the husband divorces his wife, if divorce happens, if she's pregnant, then she should not abort the child. It's haram for her to do so. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala warned against this. This is a creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the husband, he has the right to take his wife back if it's after the first or the second one, with the condition that he wants goodness as a result of that, not to cause abuse or harm to his spouse. And the rights are equal, that there are rights to be observed by the wives and there are rights to be observed by the husbands. And this is how they complement one another. They complete one another. They bring the tranquility in the household with these rights to be observed, for him to be extremely kind to his wife, not to beat up his wife, not to abuse her, not to say any bad words to her. And in return, he spends, of course, on her. And in return, she's obedient to her husband and she stays at home and she serves her husband and her children, for the household to be maintained, to be upon the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the Almighty and He's the most wise subhanahu wa ta'ala, so that nobody would use their authority in an abusive way or for people to take advantage of one another, but rather to observe that this relationship is based on love, on mercy, of people being together with matters of goodness to establish the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So again, this is brief. And that's why it's easy for a person to misunderstand things, and that's why it's an obligation upon us to learn these types of rulings and to humble ourselves to the commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to be steadfast upon the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us among those who know the religion, to apply it in their life, and to give us the best manners, whether it's towards our spouses, towards everyone, according to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from us. I would like to thank the reciters. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward you for coming and reciting these beautiful recitation. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to accept. وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
الله نزل أحسن الحديث كتابا متشابها مثانية تقشعر منه جلود الذين يخشون ربهم مثانية تقشعر منه جلود الذين يخشون ربهم ثم تلين جلودهم وقلوبهم